Okay, Robinson Crusoe Chapter 2. So to recap, we have seen Robinson leave home. We have seen him go on his first voyage, and he has essentially been shipwrecked as a result of this voyage. But he's been saved, and he is not dissuaded from his desire to go off into the world to seek his fortune, to go out to sea, despite the fact that he's kind of been given this almost a contrast between a promise of God's blessing if he stays home, if he stays with his family, and the potential that that blessing will be removed if he continues on his impetuous desire to see the world and to sort of leave this middle state that has been explained to him as being the best state to live in. And in some ways, you could see this first catastrophe, this shipwreck on his very first voyage, as a sign almost that he is in for some ill fortune. There's foreshadowing that more bad things are to come if he continues on this journey that he has set out on. And one other note is that though this was published in 1719, as we can see, Robinson himself sets out on his journey in 1651. So it was published in the 18th century, the early 18th century, but it is set in the 17th century. Chapter 2. My comrade, who had helped to harden me before and who was the master's son, was now less forward than I. The first time he spoke to me after we were at Yarmouth, which was not till 2 or 3 days, for we were separated in the town to several quarters. I say, the first time he saw me, it appeared his tone was altered. Now, if you remember, this was the friend who persuaded Robinson to come away to sea, and who initially laughed at Robinson when he was scared when they encountered their first storm. But now that they've been in this horrendous, much bigger storm and have been shipwrecked, this friend is not so keen on staying, on going out to sea. I say the first time he saw me, it appeared his tone was altered, and looking very melancholy and shaking his head, asked me how I did, and telling his father who I was and how I had come this voyage only for a trial in order to go farther abroad. His father, turning to me with a very grave and concerned tone, "Young man," says he, "you ought never to go to sea any more. You ought to take this for a plain and visible token that you are not to be a seafaring man." "Why, sir," said I, "will you go to sea no more?" "That is another case," said he. "It is my calling, and therefore my duty. But as you made this voyage for a trial, you see what a taste heaven has given you of what you are to expect if you persist. Perhaps this is all befallen us on your account, like Jonah in the ship of Tarshish." So he's being compared to the story of Jonah, where the ship that Jonah is on experiences this horrendous storm, and they are all going to be shipwrecked because of Jonah, because Jonah is not listening to what God is calling him to do. And the father of Robinson's friend is saying that maybe you are like Jonah, maybe you are not listening to God, and because of that, we experienced this horrendous storm. "Pray," continues he, "what are you, and on what account did you go to sea?" Upon that I told him some of my story, at the end of which he burst out with a strange kind of passion. "What had I done," says he, "that such an unhappy wretch should come into my ship? I would not set my foot in the same ship with thee again for 1,000 pounds. We parted soon after, for I made him little answer, and I saw him no more. Which way he went, I know not. As for me, having some money in my pocket, I traveled to London by land, and there, as well as on the road, had many struggles with myself as to what course of life I should take, and whether I should go home or go to sea. As to going home, shame opposed my best impulses, and it immediately occurred to me how I should be laughed at among the neighbors, and should be ashamed to see, not my father and mother only, but even everybody else. I have since often observed how young people are not ashamed to sin, and yet are ashamed to repent, not ashamed of the action for which they ought justly be esteemed fools, but are ashamed of the returning, which only can make them be esteemed wise men. In this state of life, however, I remained some time, uncertain what measures to take and what course of life to lead. An irresistible reluctance continued to going home, and as I stayed a while, the remembrance of the distress I had been in wore off, and as that abated, the little inclination I had in my desires to return wore off with it, till at last I quite laid aside the thoughts of it, and looked out for a voyage. It was my lot to fall into pretty good company in London, which does not always happen to such loose and unguided young fellows as I then was, the devil generally not omitting to lay some snare for them very early. But it was not so with me. I first fell acquainted with the master of a ship who had been on the coast of Guinea, and who, having a very good success there, was resolved to go again, and who, taking a fancy to my conversation, which was not at all disagreeable at that time, hearing me say I had a mind to see the world, told me if I would go to voyage with him, I should be at no expense. I should be his messmate and his companion, and if I could carry anything with me, I should have all the advantage of it that the trade would admit, and perhaps I might meet with some encouragement. I embraced the offer, which means he took the offer, and entering into a strict friendship with this captain, who was an honest and plain-dealing man, I went the voyage with him and carried a small investment with me, which by the disinterested honesty of my friend the captain I increased very considerably, for I carried about 40 pounds in such toys and trifles as the captain directed me to buy. So he's going to try to engage some kind of trade to make money. This 40 pounds I had mustered together by the assistance of some of my relations, whom I corresponded with, and who, I believe, got my father, or at least my mother, to contribute so much as to my first adventure. So much as that to my first adventure. So he has written to his family and his friends, and some of them have possibly even convinced his parents to contribute some money to him so that he can continue going adventuring and trying to engage in some kind of merchant trade expedition. This was the only voyage which I may say was successful in all my adventures, in which I owe to the integrity and honesty of my friend the captain, under whom I also got a competent knowledge of the mathematics and the rules of navigation, learned how to keep an account of the ship's course, take an observation, and in short, to understand some things that were needful to be understood by a sailor. For as he took delight to introduce me, I took delight to learn, and in a word, this voyage made me both a sailor and a merchant. For I brought home 5 pounds, 9 ounces of gold dust, which yielded me in London at my return almost 300 pounds. And this filled me with those aspiring thoughts which have since so completed my ruin. So on this expedition, he is successful. He goes with 40 pounds of things to trade with, and he comes back with gold dust equal to 300 pounds. And as a result, this encourages him to keep on seeking his fortune, which eventually leads to his ruin. I was now set up for a Guinea trader. And as a note, most Guinea traders were slave traders. And my friend, to my great misfortune, dying soon after his arrival, I resolved to go the same voyage again, and I embarked in the same vessel with one who was his mate in the former voyage, and had now got the command of the ship. This was the unhappiest voyage that ever man made. For though I did not carry quite 100 pounds of my new-gained wealth, so that I had 200 left, which I lodged with my friend's widow, who was very just to me, yet I fell into terrible misfortunes in this voyage. Our ship, making her course towards the Canary Islands, or rather between those islands and the African shore, was surprised in the grey of the morning by a Turkish rover of Sallee, who gave chase to us with all the sail she could make. We crowded also as much canvas as our yards would spread, or our masts carry, to have got clear, But finding the pirate gained upon us and would certainly come up with us in a few hours, we prepared to fight, our ship having 12 guns and the rogue 18. About 3 in the afternoon, he came up with us, and bringing to by mistake just athwart our quarter instead of athwart our stern, as he intended, we brought 8 of our guns to bear on that side and poured in a broadside upon him, which made him sheer off again after returning our fire, and pouring in also his small shot from near 200 men which he had on board. However, we had not a man touched, all our men keeping close. So basically they're shooting gunfire at each other, different kinds of weapons, but no one on Robinson's ship so far has been hit. He, that is the pirate, prepared to attack us again, and we to defend ourselves. But coming next time upon our other quarter, he entered 60 men upon our decks, who immediately fell to cutting and hacking the decks and rigging. We plied them with small shot, half-pikes, and such like, and cleared a deck of them twice. However, to cut this melancholy part of our story, our ship being disabled, and 3 of our men killed, and 8 wounded, we were obliged to yield, and were carried all prisoners into Sallee, a port belonging to the Moors. The usage I had there was not so dreadful as I first apprehended. So basically, he wasn't treated as poorly as he at first expected. Nor was I carried up the country to the Emperor of Morocco's court, as the rest of our men were, but I was kept by the captain of the rover as his own prize, and made his slave, being young and nimble and fit for his business. So Robinson, as one of the youngest people on the crew, is being kept by the captain, the pirate captain, as his slave. At this surprising change of my circumstances from a merchant to a miserable slave, I was perfectly overwhelmed. And now I looked back upon my father's prophetic discourse to me that I should be miserable and have none to relieve me, which I thought was now so effectually brought to pass that it could not be worse, that now the hand of heaven had overtaken me, and I was undone without redemption. But alas, this was but a taste of the misery I was to go through, as will appear in the sequel of this story. I meditated nothing but my escape, and what method I might take to effect it, but found no way that had the least probability in it, so that for 2 years, though I often pleased myself with the imagination, yet I never had the least encouraging prospect of putting it into practice. After about 2 years, an odd circumstance presented itself, which put the old thought of making some attempt for my liberty again in my head. My patron still had the longboat of our ship, and he ordered his carpenter to build a little stateroom or cabin in the middle of the longboat, like that of a barge, with a place to stand behind it to steer and haul home the main sheet, and room before for a hand or two to stand and work the sails. She sailed with that we call a shoulder of mutton sail, and the boom jibbed out over the top of the cabin, which lay very snug and low, and had in it room for him to lie, with a slave or two, and a table to eat on, with some small lockers to put in some bottles of such liquor as he thought fit to drink, and particularly his bread, rice, and coffee. We went frequently out with his boat fishing, and as I was most dexterous to catch fish for him, he never went without me. It happened that he had arranged to go out in this boat either for pleasure or for fish, were 2 or 3 Moors of some distinction in that place, and for whom he had provided extraordinarily, and had therefore sent on board the boat overnight a larger store of provisions than ordinary, and had ordered me to get ready 3 guns with powder and shot, which were on board his ship, for they designed some sport of fowling as well as fishing. So essentially, they have this ship that was the ship that Robinson had been on before, and they have his owner has put more provisions on board the ship than he usually does. Extra food, extra gunshot, because he has some friends that he wants to take on board with him. I got all things ready as he had directed, and waited the next morning with the boat washed clean and everything to accommodate his guests, When by and by my patron came on board alone, and told me his guests had put off going upon some business that fell out, and ordered me with a Moor, one of his kinsmen, and a young Moresco slave to go out with the boat and catch them some fish, for his friends were to sup at his house, and commanded that as soon as I had got some fish I should bring it home to his house, all which I prepared to do. This moment my former notions of deliverance darted into my thoughts, for now I found I was like to have a little ship at my command, and my master being gone, I prepared to furnish myself, not for a fishing business, but for a voyage. Though I knew not, neither did I so much as consider whither I should steer, for anywhere to get out of that place was my way. My first contrivance was to make a pretense to speak to this Moor, to get something for our subsistence on board, for I told him we must not presume to eat our patron's bread. He said that was true, so he brought a large basket of rusk or biscuit of their kind, and 3 jars with fresh water into the boat. So Robinson is convincing this other person, this Moor, to bring on extra food, extra provisions. I knew where my patron's case of bottles stood, which it was evident by the make were taken out of some English prize, and I conveyed them into the boat while the Moor was on shore, as if they had been there before for our master, and conveyed also a great lump of beeswax into the boat, which weighed about 100 weight, with a parcel of twine or thread, a hatchet, a saw, and a hammer, all which were of great use to us afterwards, especially the wax to make candles. Another trick I tried upon him, which he innocently came into also. His name was Ishmael, who they called Muley or Molly, so I called him. Molly, said I, our patron's guns are on board the boat. Can you not get a little powder and shot? It may be we will kill some fowl for ourselves, for I know he keeps the gunner's stores in the ship. Yes, says he, I'll bring some. And accordingly he brought a great leather pouch, which held about a pound and a half of powder, or rather more, and another with shot that had 5 or 6 pounds with some bullets, and put all into the boat. At the same time I found some powder of my master's in the great cabin, which I filled one of the large bottles in the case, which was almost empty, pouring what was in it into another, and thus furnished with everything needful, we sailed out of the port to fish. Except not really to fish. The castle, which is at the entrance of the port, knew who we were, and took no notice of us, and we were not above a mile out of the port before we hauled in our sail and set us down to fish. The wind blew from the north-northeast, which was contrary to my desire, for had it blown southerly, I had been sure to have made the coast of Spain, and at least reached the Bay of Cadiz. But my resolutions were, blow which way it would, I would be gone from that horrid place where I was, and leave the rest to fate. After we had fished some time and caught nothing, for when I had fish on my hook, I would not pull them up, though he might not see them, I said to the Moor, This will not do. Our master will not be thus served. We must stand farther off. He, thinking no harm, agreed, and being in the head of the boat, set the sails, and as I had the helm, I run the boat out a league farther, and then brought her to as if I would fish. When, giving the boy the helm, I stepped forward to where the Moor was, and making as if I stooped for something behind him, I took him by surprise and tossed him clear overboard into the sea. He rose immediately, for he swam like a cork, and called to me, begged to be taken in, told me he would go all over the world with me. He swam so strong after the boat that he would have reached me very quickly, there being but little wind, upon which I stepped into the cabin, and fetching one of the fowling pieces, I presented it at him. Basically, he's gone and he's gotten one of the guns that they use for killing fowl, for killing birds, and he's gone and he's pointing it at the person that he's thrown overboard. I presented it at him and told him I had done him no hurt, and if he would be quiet, I would do him none. But, said I, you swim well enough to reach to the shore, and the sea is calm. Make the best of your way to shore, and I will do you no harm. But if you come near the boat, I'll shoot you through the head, for I am resolved to have my liberty. So he turned himself about and swam for the shore, and I make no doubt but he reached it with ease, for he was an excellent swimmer. When he was gone, I turned to the boy, who they called Zuri, and said to him, Zuri, If you will be faithful to me, I'll make you a great man. But if you will not swear to be true to me, I must throw you into the sea too." The boy smiled in my face and spoke so innocently that I could not mistrust him, and swore to be faithful to me and go all over the world with me. While I was in view of the Moor that was swimming, I stood out directly to sea with the boat, that they might think me gone towards the Straits of Gibraltar, as indeed anyone that had been in their wits must have been supposed to do. For who would have supposed we were sailing on to the southward to the truly barbarian coast, where the whole nations of Negroes were sure to surround us with their canoes and destroy us, where we could never once go on shore but should be devoured by savage beasts or merciless savages? But as soon as it grew dusk in the evening, I changed my course and steered directly south and by east, bending my course a little toward the east, that I might keep in with the shore. And having a fair fresh wind and a smooth quiet sea, I made such sail that I believed by the next day at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, when I first made the land, I could not be less than 150 miles south of Sallee, quite beyond the Emperor of Morocco's dominions, or indeed of any other king thereabouts, for we saw no people. Yet such was the fright that I had taken at the Moors, and the dreadful apprehensions I had of falling into their hands, that I would not stop, or go on shore, or come to anchor, the wind continuing fair, till I had sailed in that manner 5 days. Then I ventured to make to the coast, and came to anchor in the mouth of a little river. I knew not what or where, neither what latitude, what country, what nations, or what river. I neither saw nor desired to see any people. The principal thing I wanted was fresh water. We came into this creek in the evening, resolving to swim on shore as soon as it was dark, and discover the country. But as soon as it was quite dark, we heard such dreadful noises of the barking, roaring, and howling of wild creatures of we knew not what kinds, that the poor boy was ready to die with fear, and begged of me not to go shore till day. "Well, Zuri," said I, "then I won't. But it may be we may see men by day, who will be as bad to us as those lions." "Then we give them the shoot gun," says Zuri, laughing. "We make them run away." Such English Zuri spoke by conversing among us slaves. However, I was glad to see the boy so cheerful, and I gave him a dram out of our patron's case of bottles to cheer him up. So that's kind of like a mouthful of alcohol, a dram. After all, Zuri's advice was good, and I took it. We dropped our little anchor and lay still all night. I say still, for we slept none, for in 2 or 3 hours we saw vast great creatures, we knew not what to call them, of many sorts, come down to the seashore and run into the water, wallowing and washing themselves for the pleasure of cooling themselves, and they made such hideous howlings and yellings that I never indeed heard the like. This convinced me that there was no going on shore for us in the night upon the coast, and how to venture on shore in the day was another question too. For to have fallen into the hands of any of the savages had been as bad as to have fallen into the hands of lions and tigers. At least we were equally apprehensive of the danger of it. Be that as it would, we were obliged to go on shore somewhere or other for water, for we had not a pint left in the boat. When or where to get to it was the point. Zuri said if I would let him go on shore with one of the jars, he would find if there was any water and bring some to me. I asked him why he should go, why I should not go, and he stay in the boat. The boy answered with so much affection that made me love him ever after. Says he, "If wild mans come, they eat me. You go way." "Well, Zuri," said I, "we will both go, and if wild mans come, we will kill them, and they shall eat neither of us." We took the boat in as near the shore as we thought was proper, and so waded on shore, carrying nothing but our arms and 2 jars for water. I did not care to go out of sight of the boat, fearing the coming of canoes with savages down the river. But the boy, seeing a low place about a mile up the country, rambled to it, and by I saw him come running towards me. I thought he was pursued by some savage or frightened by some wild beast, and I ran towards him to help him. But when I came nearer to him, I saw something hanging over his shoulders, which was a creature that he had shot, like a hare, but different in color and longer legs. However, we were very glad of it, and it was very good meat. But the great joy that poor Xury came with was to tell me he had found good water and seen no wild mans. As I had been one voyage to this coast before, I knew very well that the islands of the Canaries and the Cape de Verde Islands also lay not far off from the coast. But as I had no instruments to take an observation to know what latitude we were in, and did not exactly know, or at least remember what latitude they were in, I knew not where to look for them, or when to stand off to sea towards them. Otherwise I might now easily have found some of these islands. But my hope was that if I stood along this coast till I came to that part where the English traded, I should find some of their vessels upon their usual design of trade, that would relieve and take us in. By the best of my calculation, that place where I now was must be that country which, lying between the Emperor of Morocco's dominions and the Negroes, lies waste and uninhabited, except by wild beasts. And indeed, for near 100 miles together upon this coast, we saw nothing but a vast uninhabited country by day, and heard nothing but howlings and roarings of wild beasts by night. Once or twice in the daytime I thought I saw the high top of the mountain Tenerife in the Canaries, and had a great mind to venture out in hopes of reaching thither. But having tried twice, I was forced in again by contrary winds, the sea also going too high for my little vessel. So I resolved to pursue my first design and keep along the shore. Several times I was obliged to land for fresh water after we had left this place, and once we had to kill a lion. This was game indeed to us, but this was no food, and I was very sorry to lose 3 charges of powder and shot upon a creature that was good for nothing to us. I bethought myself, however, that perhaps the skin of him might one way or other be of some value to us, and I resolved to take off his skin if I could. So Xury and I went to work with him, but Xury was much the better workman at it, for I knew very ill how to do it. Indeed, it took us the whole day, but alas, we got off the hide of him and spread it out on the top of our cabin. The sun effectually dried it in 2 days' time, and it afterwards served me to lie upon. So he's using the lion's skin, the hide, as his bed. After this stop, we made on to the southward continually for 10 or 12 days, living very sparing on our provisions, which began to abate very much, and going no oftener into shore than we were obliged for fresh water. My design in this was to reach anywhere about the Cape de Verde, where I was in hopes to meet with some European ship, and if I did not, I knew not what course I had to take, but to seek out for the islands or perish there among the Negroes. I knew that all the ships from Europe which sailed either to the coast or Guinea, or to Brazil, or to East Indies, made this cape or those islands, and in a word, I put the whole of my fortune upon this single point, either that I must meet with some ship or must perish. So they're running low on provisions, but they're going to keep going. So we continued for 10 more days. Then on the 11th day, as I was very pensive, I stepped into the cabin and sat me down, Xury having the helm, when on a sudden the boy cried out, "Master, master, a ship with sail!" And the foolish boy was frightened out of his wits, thinking it must needs be some of his master's ships sent to pursue us, when I knew we were far enough out of their reach. I jumped out of the cabin and immediately saw not only the ship, but that it was a Portuguese ship. With all the sail I could make, I found I should not be able to come in their way, but that they would be gone by before I could make any signal to them. But after I had put on as much sail as possible and began to despair, they, it seems, saw me by the help of their perspective glasses, and that it was some European boat, which as they supposed must belong to some ship that was lost, so they shortened sail to let me come up. They asked me what I was, in Portuguese and in Spanish and in French, but I understood none of them. But at last a Scots sailor who was on board called to me, and I answered him and told him I was an Englishman, that I had made my escape out of slavery from the Moors at Sallee. Then they bade me come on board, and very kindly took me in, and all my goods. So Robinson and Zuri have been rescued by this Portuguese ship. And we will see in the next chapter what Robinson decides to do next.